Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. The Oregon Ducks commitment sweatshirt comes back on for a second time in 24 hours as former Northwestern cornerback Theran Johnson committing to the Oregon Ducks. And the first thing that comes to my mind is one, it's never enough for Dan Lanning. You look at the boundary cornerback position, I totally understand you're losing a lot of veteran good players after this year. Nico Reed, Dante Manning, Jabbar Muhammad. The boundary cornerback position going into 2025, it's not necessarily a concern for me, right? You look at Dakota Fields, Iffy, Roderick Pleasant, you have Naheem Alford and Brandon Finney coming in, two five-star cornerbacks as freshmen. Dan Lanning wants competitive depth at every single position on the football field. And Theron Johnson, a guy that I give him all the credit in the world because he knows what he's getting into. Like, he's transferring into a deep and talented cornerback room, but I think this makes sense for both Theron Johnson and Dan Lanning. Dan Lanning probably looking at the boundary cornerback spot and saying, hey, we're really talented. We got a lot of young studs who can play at a high level, but we're going to be relatively young going into 2025. Why not add a boundary cornerback in Theron Johnson, who's played over 1,500 snaps in the Big Ten, was an all Big Ten member in 2024. Just the best continue to get better is probably where I want to start with Theron Johnson. Now, we're going to get into what he brings to this Oregon Ducks program. I also want to touch on Rashad Samples remaining at Oregon, which I think is a massive storyline for the Oregon Duck fans. Before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys and to the Oregon Duck fans. It's been a blast talking this program really for the last 12 months, really since Dan Lanning has taken over this program. The amount of support y'all continue to show means the absolute world. If you guys do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into Theron Johnson. I think it first starts with experience. I mean, this is a multi-year starter in the Big Ten at Northwestern, over 1,500 snaps. Go back to 2024, 2 interceptions, 10 pass breakups. He's been targeted 141 times in his career, has only allowed 85 catches, a 65% completion percentage when targeted. Now, I think what's really interesting, one, kind of a prerequisite for really every Oregon cornerback that Dan Lanning recruits, can you tackle? I mean, Theron Johnson was third on the team in tackles, only missed 11%, which is a phenomenal number for a boundary cornerback who's forced to tackle in space. Does Theron Johnson play nickel for Oregon is kind of what I'm interested in. Because I do look at the boundary cornerback spot and say Dan Lanning's probably feeling pretty comfortable. And Theron Johnson, a little bit more of a short area twitch kind of athlete, 5'11", 185. That to me screams nickelback. We'll see if he makes that move. He's played boundary cornerback for the majority of his career at Northwestern. Does Dan Lanning maybe kick him on inside as a nickel? We'll kind of see, especially with the guy like Brandon Johnson going to the NFL after this year. I believe he's out of eligibility. Someone might want to fact check me on that. That's a potential for a guy like Theron Johnson. At the end of the day, to me, this is just adding another really good player into the defensive back room, which is what Oregon did last year too. And I think when you have that healthy competition, Nico Reed kind of won the job for Oregon. He was a stud. Jabbar Muhammad, we knew what he was coming over from Washington. The more good players, we say this all the time. Like, I think Dan Lanning learned this from his time with Kirby Smart and Nick Saban. Like, it's never enough competitive depth. And the more good players you stack in a position room, the better you are going to get out of your starters. And it's obviously worked for Oregon in 2024. Now, an interesting talking point that you'll see some fans on Twitter talk about is, all right, bringing in a guy like Theron Johnson, are you squeezing out some of the young studs that you want to see play over the next couple of years? Dan Lanning has continued to use the transfer portal rather aggressively. They don't really lose the guys they don't want to lose. I think that's really worth noting. One, I think it's a culture thing. Like, I think guys just trust the process under Dan Lanning. But more importantly, I mean, we saw Oregon add a lot of talented defensive backs last year in the portal. Oregon made a lot of additions in the transfer portal last year. And one of the things we talked about, why I considered Oregon such a big winner in the transfer portal last offseason, yes, they got a lot of players to come into their program, but they didn't, with all due respect to the guys that decided to transfer out, they didn't really lose the players that they thought were the future studs of this program. And again, once again you're seeing, yes, you've seen guys like Jaquan McRoy decide to transfer out, but I don't think a ton of the names that you've seen, I believe there's been 4, you didn't really look at those guys and say, oh yeah, that one hurts really bad. It's kind of just that healthy balance between, yeah, you're bringing some guys in that are elevating this room, and some other guys that maybe aren't going to see the playing field are transferring out. But there's not been a ton of guys, even though Oregon continues to bring players in, that are getting squeezed out of that program. And I think that's really, really important to keep in mind. I look at this secondary next year. I mean, you look at the safety spot, it obviously got a heck of a lot better with Dylan Tiemann coming in from Purdue yesterday. You got Aaron Flowers, Peyton Woodyard, Kingston Lopa. Then you look at the cornerback spot, Iffy, Dakota Fields, Brandon Finney, Naheem Offer coming in, Roderick Pleasant. You had a guy like Theran Johnson. The amount of talent in the secondary is incredible for the Oregon Ducks. Now, I want to mention two things. One, Jamari Johnson from Louisville, tight end. Sounds like Oregon is probably in the driver's seat for this one. I remember covering Jamari Johnson when he was coming out of high school. Now, he's been quiet at Louisville for the first 2 years. This would be, to me, make a ton of sense to balance out a guy like Kenyon Sadiq. A guy like Kenyon Sadiq, you want to get involved in so many different ways, split him out wide, get him some end arounds. Jamari Johnson, more of that inline, big bodied blocking tight end who's a good athlete, can certainly give you some juice in the passing game, so to speak. But at 6'5", 270, you're getting a dog in the run blocking department. So, on paper, you look at, hey, Kenyon Sadiq's coming in. We feel pretty, or staying on the team in 2025. We feel pretty good. Well, we know Oregon likes to run a lot of 12 personnel, which means having two tight ends on the field. You get Jamari Johnson as your inline tight end who can be a hammer in the run blocking department. Then you add a guy like Kenyon Sadiq who can continue to be that creative offensive weapon within this Oregon offense. Last storyline of the day, Rashad Samples sticking with Oregon. This was a guy that was getting some head coaching offers at the G5 level. I believe Texas State, Sam Houston, one of the two. This is huge. Everybody asked why Oregon and what they're doing on the recruiting trail. Yes, we know Oregon is very competitive in the NIL, but you also look at Dan Lanning and say he's surrounded himself with a coaching staff that is elite on the recruiting trail. Yes, Rashad Samples, a very good running backs and wide receiver coach during his tenure before coming to Oregon. One of the big reasons that Dan Lanning decided to bring Rashad Samples in is what he can do on the recruiting trail, specifically in the state of Texas. You look at the commitment of Decorian Moore, I would think Rashad Samples, there's no doubt in my mind, he played a massive role in getting Decorian Moore to commit to Oregon. Yes, they're competitive in NIL, just like any other top Power 4 or elite Power 4 program, you might say. But surrounding yourself with this kind of coaching staff, it's something I think Dan Lanning has nailed, that all elite head coaches do. You got to make sure you surround yourself with a strong staff. Dan Lanning's clearly done that, as evidence of Rashad Samples, a very young guy, getting head coaching offers. Keeping him in Oregon, staff retention, and Rashad Samples at some point is going to move on up in the world. I think we all know that. This kid, I call him a kid, he's older, but he's going to move up in the world. But right now, keeping him on staff, I think that's really big for Oregon as well. We'll close it out there. Exciting time to be an Oregon fan. Getting active in the portal. Got the playoff run to make. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the grab to the channel, appreciate you guys. We'll talk to y'all later. Peace.